The morning sun blazed across Naval Air Station Oceana as Senior Airman Marcus Thompson wiped sweat from his forehead. The Virginia heat was already brutal at 800 hours, and he knew it would only get worse. His team had been working on the F-18 Super Hornet since dawn, but something was seriously wrong with the aircraft. The massive fighter jet sat silent on the tarmac like a sleeping giant. Its twin engines, usually roaring with enough power to launch the 30-ton machine off aircraft carriers, were completely dead. Not even a whisper of life came from the sophisticated machinery that cost taxpayers over $70 million. "Try it again," called out Staff Sergeant Rodriguez from beneath the aircraft. Marcus climbed back into the cockpit and went through the startup sequence for the 15th time that morning. He flipped switches in the exact order outlined in the technical manual, checked every gauge, and pressed the engine start button. Nothing. The control panel remained dark except for a few warning lights that mocked their efforts. The engines that should have been screaming to life stayed silent. Marcus felt his frustration building as he realized they were no closer to solving the problem than when they started. Down on the ground, Rodriguez emerged from under the aircraft, his uniform stained with hydraulic fluid and his face showing the same bewilderment that Marcus felt. They had checked every system twice. The fuel lines were clear, the electrical connections looked good, and all the safety protocols had been followed perfectly. "This doesn't make sense," Rodriguez muttered, pulling off his work gloves. "Everything checks out on paper. The bird should be purring like a kitten by now." The pressure was mounting because this wasn't just any routine maintenance day. The F-18 was scheduled for a critical training mission that afternoon. A group of new pilots fresh from flight school were depending on this aircraft to complete their carrier landing qualifications. Without this plane, their training would be delayed by weeks, potentially affecting their deployment schedules. Marcus had been working on military aircraft for 6 years, and Rodriguez had 12 years of experience under his belt. Between them, they had solved countless mechanical problems and brought dozens of aircraft back to life. But this F-18 was stumping them completely. Word of their struggle began to spread around the base. Other mechanics stopped by to offer suggestions, but none of their ideas worked. The flight crew chief arrived to assess the situation, followed by the maintenance officer who wanted updates every 30 minutes. As the morning wore on, the simple engine startup problem was becoming a major incident that threatened to ground not just one aircraft, but potentially affect the entire day's training schedule. The base commander had already been informed, and there were whispers about calling in specialists from the manufacturer. The two airmen stood beside the silent fighter, staring at it as if willing it to start through sheer determination. They had tried everything in their considerable toolkit of knowledge and experience. Every manual had been consulted, every procedure followed to the letter. But the F-18 remained stubbornly silent, its engines cold and unresponsive, while the clock ticked toward the scheduled mission time that was beginning to look impossible to meet. By 1,000 hours, the situation had escalated beyond a simple maintenance issue. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the squadron commander, arrived at the flight line with a grim expression. She had been fielding calls from higher command about the delayed training mission, and the pressure was starting to show. "Talk to me, Rodriguez," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had flown combat missions over 3 different theaters of operation. "What's the status?" Rodriguez straightened to attention before explaining their predicament. "Ma'am, we've run diagnostics on every system. Fuel flow is normal. Electrical systems check out, hydraulics are good, but the engines won't even attempt to start. It's like the ignition system is completely dead, but all our tests show it should be working." The colonel walked around the aircraft, her trained eye taking in every detail. She had started her career as a maintenance officer before becoming a pilot, so she understood both sides of aviation operations. What she saw didn't make sense either. Marcus joined the conversation, holding a thick technical manual. "Ma'am, we've followed every troubleshooting procedure in the book. We even called the technical support hotline, but they're suggesting the same steps we've already completed multiple times." The weight of the situation was becoming clear to everyone involved. This wasn't just about one training flight anymore. The ripple effects were spreading throughout the base operations. Other squadrons were having to adjust their schedules, training slots were being shuffled, and instructors were scrambling to find alternative aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell made a decision that surprised everyone. "I want you to expand your search for solutions. Check with some of the retired personnel who live in the area, sometimes experience trumps technology. Her suggestion raised eyebrows among the younger mechanics. The F-18 Super Hornet was packed with sophisticated computer systems and digital diagnostics that hadn't existed when the older generation was active duty. How could someone who had worked on older aircraft possibly help with such an advanced machine? But the colonel had seen enough in her career to know that mechanical principles often remained consistent across different generations of aircraft. Rodriguez, reach out to the local Veterans Association, see if any former aircraft mechanics are willing to take a look. As word spread about their unusual request for help, Marcus began to feel skeptical. He had grown up with computers and digital systems. The idea that someone from an earlier era could solve a problem that had stumped him and his team seemed unlikely. The base's computer systems were consulted for any similar incidents in the maintenance database. Technical representatives from the aircraft manufacturer were contacted for additional guidance. Even engineers from the engine company were brought into conference calls to discuss possible solutions. Yet the F-18 remained silent and uncooperative. Around noon, Rodriguez returned from making his calls to the Veterans Association. "I've found someone willing to help," he announced. "His name is Frank Morrison, retired Air Force Master Sergeant. He worked on aircraft for 30 years before retiring 5 years ago." The description of Morrison made him sound like exactly the kind of old-school mechanic that Marcus had always been taught to respect but secretly wondered about. Could someone who had learned his trade before modern diagnostics really contribute anything meaningful to solving their high-tech problem? Within an hour, they received word that Morrison was driving to the base and would arrive shortly. The veteran had agreed to take a look at their problem, though he had warned them that modern aircraft were quite different from what he was used to working on. As they waited for his arrival, Marcus and Rodriguez continued their attempts to start the engines, hoping they might stumble across the solution before the retired mechanic arrived. But the F-18 continued to mock their efforts with its stubborn silence. Frank Morrison arrived at the main gate in a well-worn pickup truck that had seen better decades. The security guards were expecting him, and after a quick background check and temporary badge issuance, he was escorted to the flight line where the problematic F-18 waited. Marcus watched as the retired Master Sergeant climbed out of his truck. Morrison was a lean man in his early 60s with calloused hands and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He wore faded jeans and a polo shirt that had Vietnam veteran embroidered on the chest. His gray hair was cut in a military style that suggested old habits died hard. "You boys having some trouble with this bird?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl as he approached the aircraft. His casual demeanor contrasted sharply with the stressed expressions of the younger mechanics who had been fighting this problem all morning. Rodriguez stepped forward to make introductions and explain the situation. As he talked, Morrison walked slowly around the F-18, occasionally stopping to examine different components. His inspection seemed almost leisurely compared to the frantic diagnostic procedures the team had been running. "Mind if I take a look under the hood?" Morrison asked with a slight grin. Marcus almost smiled at the automotive reference applied to a $70 million fighter jet, but he was too tired and frustrated to find much humor in their situation. Morrison accepted a pair of safety glasses and began his own examination of the aircraft. What struck Marcus immediately was how different the veterans' approach was from their own. While they had been focused on running computerized diagnostics and following detailed technical procedures, Morrison seemed to be using his senses in ways that Marcus hadn't considered. The retired mechanic placed his hand on various components, listening carefully to the aircraft in ways that went beyond simply looking at gauges and readouts. He spent several minutes examining the engine intake areas, running his fingers along edges and connections that the younger mechanics had already tested multiple times. "When did you last fly this aircraft?" Morrison asked, still examining the engines. 3 days ago, Rodriguez replied. "Routine training flight, no problems reported. It's been sitting here since then for scheduled maintenance." Morrison nodded thoughtfully and continued his inspection. He asked questions about the weather conditions over the past few days, the aircraft's parking position, and details about the maintenance procedures that had been performed. His questions seemed random to Marcus, who was used to following systematic diagnostic flowcharts. "You boys mind if I try something a little different?" Morrison asked after completing his visual inspection. "I know your computers are telling you everything should work, But sometimes machines have problems that don't show up on the fancy equipment. Marcus felt his skepticism growing. The F-18's diagnostic systems were incredibly sophisticated, designed to identify problems that human senses couldn't detect. How could this retired mechanic with his old-fashioned approach possibly find something that their advanced equipment had missed? But Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell had specifically requested they consider outside help, and Morrison had driven all the way to the base to assist them. Marcus decided to keep his doubts to himself and see what the veteran had in mind. Morrison pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and began examining areas of the aircraft that seemed completely unrelated to the engine startup problem. He looked at landing gear components, wing surfaces, and even the aircraft's pitot tubes used for airspeed measurement. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" Rodriguez asked, clearly curious about Morrison's unconventional diagnostic approach. "Experience has taught me that aircraft problems aren't always where you think they are," Morrison replied without looking up from his examination. "Sometimes you have to think like the airplane instead of thinking like a mechanic." His comment made no sense to Marcus, who had been trained to follow logical, systematic procedures for troubleshooting mechanical problems. But Morrison's confidence suggested he knew something they didn't, even if his methods seemed outdated compared to their high-tech approach. Morrison spent another 20 minutes examining the aircraft with an intensity that surprised Marcus. The veteran's approach was methodical, but completely different from the systematic procedures they had been following. He seemed to be looking for something specific, though he hadn't shared what that might be. "Tell me about the weather 3 nights ago," Morrison said suddenly, straightening up from where he had been examining the aircraft's belly. Rodriguez consulted his maintenance log. "We had a pretty severe thunderstorm that evening. Lots of rain, high winds. Why do you ask?" Morrison nodded as if that information confirmed something he had suspected. "And this aircraft was parked outside during that storm?" "Yes, sir, all our aircraft were. That's normal procedure unless we're expecting hail." The retired mechanic walked to the front of the aircraft and knelt down near the nose gear. He aimed his flashlight into what appeared to be a small opening and spent several minutes examining something that the younger mechanics couldn't see from their angle. "Bingo," Morrison said quietly, standing up with a satisfied expression. "I think I found your problem." Marcus and Rodriguez quickly joined him near the nose of the aircraft. Morrison pointed to a small drainage hole that was part of the aircraft's design, intended to allow water to escape from internal compartments. "See this little opening here?" Morrison asked. "It's supposed to drain water away from the electronics bay. But look what's happened." Marcus leaned in closer and saw what Morrison was indicating. The drainage hole was completely blocked by what appeared to be mud and debris that had been blown into it during the recent storm. "I don't understand," Marcus said. "How would a blocked drain hole prevent the engines from starting?" Morrison's explanation revealed decades of practical experience with aircraft systems. When that drain gets blocked, water can't escape from the electronics compartment. The moisture builds up and eventually reaches sensitive components that control engine ignition systems. Rodriguez looked skeptical, but our diagnostic computers didn't show any electrical problems. "That's because the problem is intermittent," Morrison explained patiently. "The moisture creates just enough interference to prevent proper ignition sequencing, but not enough to trigger the diagnostic systems. The computers think everything is fine because the connections are technically intact." The veteran's theory made sense from an engineering standpoint, but Marcus was still doubtful. Could such a simple problem really have stumped their sophisticated diagnostic equipment for an entire morning? Morrison suggested they clear the blocked drainage hole and then attempt to dry out the affected electronics compartment. "You'll probably need to remove some access panels and use compressed air to blow out any moisture that's accumulated." The process Morrison described would take about 30 minutes to complete, much less time than they had already spent running computerized diagnostics, but it required accessing parts of the aircraft that weren't typically included in standard troubleshooting procedures. Rodriguez made the decision to follow Morrison's advice. They gathered the necessary tools and began removing access panels to reach the electronics compartment that the veteran had identified. As they worked, Morrison shared stories about similar problems he had encountered on older aircraft. "Back in my day, we didn't have computers to tell us what was wrong," Morrison said as he helped guide their work. "We had to learn to read the aircraft like a book. Every sound, every vibration, every little detail could tell you something important. When they opened the electronics compartment, Marcus was amazed to see visible moisture droplets on several circuit boards. The water hadn't caused obvious damage, but it was clearly present in amounts that could interfere with sensitive electronic operations. Using compressed air and absorbent materials, they carefully dried the affected components while Morrison supervised their work. His guidance helped them avoid damaging delicate circuits while ensuring thorough moisture removal. As they worked, Marcus began to appreciate the difference between book knowledge and practical experience. Morrison's approach hadn't relied on sophisticated diagnostic equipment, but rather on understanding how aircraft systems interacted with environmental conditions. "The newer aircraft are amazing machines," Morrison commented as they finished the drying process. "But they're still subject to the same basic principles that affected the planes I worked on 30 years ago. Water and electronics don't mix no matter how advanced the technology becomes." With the moisture removed and the drainage hole cleared, they reassembled the access panels and prepared to test Morrison's theory about the cause of their engine startup problem. The moment of truth had arrived. Marcus climbed back into the cockpit of the F-18 while Rodriguez and Morrison watched from the ground. After hours of frustration and failed attempts, they were about to discover whether the retired veteran's simple solution would work. Marcus went through the engine startup sequence one more time, but now he felt a different kind of anticipation. Morrison's confident explanation had given him hope that this attempt might finally succeed, where all their previous efforts had failed. He flipped the master electrical switch and watched as the cockpit displays came to life. The instrument panel glowed with its usual array of lights and digital readouts, looking exactly as it had during all their previous unsuccessful attempts. Moving through the pre-start checklist, Marcus reached the critical moment. He positioned his hand over the engine start switch for the left engine and took a deep breath. Around the aircraft, Rodriguez and Morrison stood ready to monitor the startup process. Marcus pressed the switch. For a few seconds, nothing happened, just as it had been all morning. Then suddenly, they heard the distinctive whine of the engine beginning to spool up. The sound started as a barely audible whisper, but quickly grew into the familiar roar of the F-404 turbofan engine coming to life. "Hot damn!" Rodriguez shouted over the increasing engine noise. The left engine was running smoothly, all its parameters showing normal readings on Marcus's instrument panel. Without hesitation, Marcus initiated the startup sequence for the right engine. This time, the engine responded immediately, roaring to life with the same healthy sound as its partner. Within minutes, both engines were running at idle power, their exhaust creating heat waves in the air behind the aircraft. Marcus looked down from the cockpit to see Morrison standing beside the aircraft with a satisfied smile on his weathered face. The retired mechanic looked like a man who had seen this kind of problem before and knew exactly how it would end once the real cause was identified and corrected. Rodriguez was practically dancing with excitement as he monitored the engine parameters on his ground equipment. All the readings were perfectly normal. The F-18 was running exactly as it should have been all along. After allowing the engines to run for several minutes to ensure stable operation, Marcus shut them down according to proper procedures. The silence that followed was different from the frustrated silence they had endured all morning. This was the satisfied quiet of a problem solved. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell arrived just as the engines were winding down. She had been monitoring the situation from her office and came to see the results of Morrison's intervention personally. "I heard engines running," she said to Rodriguez. "Please tell me that means what I think it means." "Yes, ma'am," Rodriguez replied with obvious relief in his voice. Master Sergeant Morrison identified the problem: blocked drainage causing moisture accumulation in the electronics bay. "We cleared the blockage, dried out the components, and the bird fired right up." The colonel turned to Morrison with an expression of genuine respect. "Master Sergeant, I can't thank you enough. You've saved us a major operational disruption and probably prevented this aircraft from being grounded for days while technicians tried to figure out what was wrong." Morrison waved off the praise with typical modesty. "Just glad I could help, ma'am. These young mechanics did all the real work once they knew where to look. Sometimes it just takes a different perspective to see what's right in front of you." Marcus climbed down from the cockpit feeling a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Relief because their problem was finally solved, but embarrassment because such a simple issue had stumped him for so long. As if reading his thoughts, Morrison approached him with a friendly expression. "Don't feel bad about missing this one, son. I've been doing this for 30 years and I've seen this exact problem at least a dozen times. Experience is just a fancy word for having made a lot of mistakes and learned from them." The veterans' words helped Marcus realize that their morning hadn't been a failure, but rather a valuable learning experience. He had just gained knowledge that no technical manual could provide, taught by someone whose expertise came from decades of hands-on problem-solving. With the F-18 now operational, the afternoon training mission could proceed as originally scheduled. The young pilots who had been waiting anxiously all morning were finally able to complete their carrier landing qualifications, their training timeline back on track thanks to Morrison's intervention. But the impact of the morning's events extended far beyond just getting one aircraft running again. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell recognized that something important had happened that deserved further attention. She called a meeting in the squadron conference room that included Morrison, Rodriguez, Marcus, and several other senior maintenance personnel. The purpose was to discuss what they could learn from the morning's experience. "What happened today illustrates something we need to think about more carefully," the colonel began. "We have incredible diagnostic technology, but we shouldn't become so dependent on it that we forget basic troubleshooting principles." Morrison sat quietly as the discussion unfolded, but it was clear that his unconventional approach had made a lasting impression on everyone present. The retired mechanic had solved in 30 minutes a problem that had stumped their modern diagnostic systems for hours. Marcus found himself thinking about the broader implications of what had occurred. Their computerized diagnostic equipment was designed to identify problems within normal parameters. But it had been essentially blind to Morrison's moisture problem, because the issue fell outside its programmed expectations. "The thing is," Rodriguez observed during the discussion, "our diagnostic systems kept telling us everything was fine. We trusted the computers more than our own instincts." Morrison finally spoke up, offering his perspective on the situation. "Technology is a wonderful tool, but it's still just a tool. The human brain can make connections and see patterns that computers might miss, especially when dealing with unusual circumstances." The colonel asked Morrison if he would be willing to visit the base occasionally to share his experience with younger mechanics. The idea of creating an informal mentorship program appealed to everyone in the room. "We could set up a program where experienced veterans like yourself could work with our current maintenance crews," Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell suggested, "not to replace our modern procedures, but to supplement them with practical knowledge that comes from years of hands-on experience." Morrison agreed to consider the proposal, though he warned that he was still learning about modern aircraft systems himself. "These new planes are amazing compared to what I worked on, but the basic principles of mechanical troubleshooting haven't changed much." The meeting concluded with plans to develop a more formal relationship between the base and local veteran mechanics. The goal would be to create opportunities for knowledge transfer that could prevent similar situations in the future. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Marcus approached Morrison privately. "I wanted to thank you personally," he said, "and I wanted to ask how you knew to look for that drainage problem when our diagnostics didn't show anything." Morrison's answer revealed the depth of his practical experience. "When you told me about the thunderstorm 3 nights ago, I started thinking about where water might accumulate on an aircraft. I've seen moisture cause electrical problems more times than I can count, so I looked for places where water might collect and cause trouble." "But how did you know to check that specific drainage hole?" "Because I've seen similar problems on different aircraft over the years," Morrison explained. "The technology changes, but water still behaves the same way it always has. Gravity pulls it downward, and if it can't drain properly, it accumulates in low spots where it can cause problems." Marcus realized that Morrison's diagnostic approach had been based on understanding fundamental physical principles, rather than relying on sophisticated equipment. The veteran had used his knowledge of how water behaves in aircraft systems to guide his investigation. "The key is learning to think like the aircraft," Morrison continued. "Instead of just following procedures, try to understand what the machine is experiencing. Sometimes that leads you to solutions that aren't in any manual." As they walked back toward the flight line, Marcus felt like he had received an education that no technical school could provide. Morrison had shown him that effective troubleshooting required more than just following diagnostic procedures. 3 months later, The mentorship program that had grown out of Morrison's visit was officially launched at Naval Air Station Oceana. The program paired experienced veteran mechanics with active duty personnel, creating opportunities for knowledge transfer that benefited both groups. Morrison had become a regular visitor to the base, spending 2 days each week working alongside the maintenance crews. His presence had already prevented several similar problems and had taught the younger mechanics to think beyond their diagnostic computers. Marcus had become one of Morrison's most enthusiastic students, eager to learn the practical troubleshooting techniques that weren't covered in technical manuals. Under the veteran's guidance, he had developed a more intuitive approach to aircraft maintenance that complemented his technical training. "The thing I've learned," Marcus explained to a group of newly arrived mechanics, "is that computers are great at telling you what they're programmed to look for, but they can't think outside their programming the way humans can." The mentorship program had attracted attention from other military bases, with several installations requesting information about how to develop similar programs. The combination of modern diagnostic technology with experienced practical knowledge was proving to be more effective than either approach alone. Rodriguez had been promoted to senior staff sergeant, partly based on his willingness to embrace innovative solutions like bringing in Morrison to help with the F-18 problem. His experience that day had taught him the value of considering unconventional approaches when standard procedures weren't working. The F-18 that had caused so much trouble that morning had become something of a legend on the base. It had flown dozens of successful missions since Morrison's repair, with no recurrence of the drainage problem. The aircraft's maintenance history now included detailed notes about checking drainage holes after severe weather events. Morrison had also learned from his experience with the younger mechanics. Their knowledge of modern aircraft systems had helped him understand how traditional troubleshooting principles applied to contemporary technology. The exchange of knowledge had benefited everyone involved. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell had received commendation from higher command for her innovative approach to solving maintenance challenges. Her decision to reach out to retired veterans had created a model that was being adopted by other units across the military. The base's overall maintenance efficiency had improved measurably since the program began. Problems were being solved more quickly, and the combination of diagnostic technology with practical experience was preventing issues that might have previously resulted in extended aircraft downtime. But perhaps the most important outcome was the change in attitude among the maintenance crews. They had learned to value both technological tools and human experience, understanding that the most effective approach combined the best of both worlds. Marcus often reflected on that frustrating morning when their sophisticated diagnostic equipment had failed to identify such a simple problem. The experience had taught him that effective troubleshooting required more than just following procedures and trusting computers. Morrison's simple observation about thinking like the aircraft had become a guiding principle for the entire maintenance operation. Mechanics were now encouraged to consider not just what their diagnostic equipment was telling them, but also what the aircraft itself might be experiencing. The retired veteran's willingness to share his knowledge had created ripple effects that extended far beyond solving one engine startup problem. His intervention had demonstrated the value of experience and had helped bridge the gap between different generations of aircraft maintenance professionals. As Morrison often reminded the younger mechanics, technology would continue to evolve, but the fundamental principles of troubleshooting would remain constant. The key was learning to use both modern tools and traditional techniques to solve problems that neither approach could handle alone. The story of the dead F-18 and the retired veteran who saved the day had become part of the base's folklore, a reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated problems required the simplest solutions, and that experience and wisdom were just as valuable as the latest technology.